Yes.
So we'd reached 1978. As you heard earlier in the week, in April 1978, the announcement was made by the Lister Institute that it proposed to close its laboratories at Elstree. That prompted Dr. Lane to write a report addressed to Professor Mollison. He refers to it in his witness statement at paragraph 170, but here I'd like to show you the underlying document. It's CBLA 0000758. So you can see there it's headed Closure of the Vaccines and Sera Laboratories of the Lister Institute Elstree and the Implications for the Blood Products Laboratory to Professor P.L. Mollison. And we know it's from Dr. Lane from his statement, although the signature is somewhat indistinct. If we go to bottom of page 2, we see a heading, The Future of BPL at Elstree, and the various implications which Dr. Lane then sets out. What I wanted to do, however, is take you to page 4, under the heading Future Administration of BPL. Dr. Lane says this, picking it up in the 4th line, BPL has expanded to become a considerable national resource within the health service and must increase further to meet the projected requirements for blood products scheduled over the next 10 years. As an operation within the health service, it stands alone. By its own development, contains the expert opinion needed to guide and plan future running and redevelopment. BPL should now have its own administration so that it can function as a complete unit. And then Dr. Lane sets out some suggestions as to what the constitutional arrangements should be for BPL. And then if we go to the top of the next page, this is really the observation I wanted to draw attention to. Under the, at the beginning of the page, it says this: development of BPL is hampered predominantly by the inordinately slow process of decision-taking by DHS. So that's the general observation Dr. Lane there makes. Then he goes on again to talk about what arrangements could be put in place for the running of BPL in the future. He says, by interposing professionally inappropriate controlling bodies between management of BPL and DHSS, merely serves to delay planning and to remove from DHSS the need to maintain an essential and close contact with BPL so that its administration is always fully informed. BPL is a DHSS central laboratory in the transfusion service. It would not benefit from the constraints of a governing body poorly represented in blood transfusion skills. And then the last paragraph on that page talks about the advantage of a fully constituted managing subcommittee. If we go back to the statement then at CBLA 605_002, page 70, you'll see in paragraph 170, Dr. Lane refers to the report that we've just looked at, his report to Dr. Mollison, and sets out how he viewed the Lister's closure as a unique opportunity for the development and future of BPL. And then paragraph 171, he then talks about the significance of the closure of the Lister Institute for a number of reasons: jeopardise the status of the 78-79 budget, stopgap proposals needed review because the future of existing buildings was unknown. Activities had therefore to be diverted to such questions as the future of the site, the future of BPL, and the question of long-term management. As the position presented itself, operations could have ceased, reference to Dr. Maycock's retirement. It was possible that the DOH would, and then we see another constant theme, perceive an immediate need to resort to Scotland for Factor VIII concentrate if the Scottish figures were to be believed. Then he says, essentially, as it turns out, the closure couldn't come at a better time. The department decided to buy the Lister site, etc. And then if we go down to paragraph 173 on the same page, you'll note the reference to a regional transfusion directors meeting on the 5th of July. I don't propose to take you to the detail of that, and again, I think some of it you've seen from Mr. Hill's presentation, but you'll note that Dr. Lane says, as he recalls, this was the first meeting of the regional transfusion directors which he was permitted to attend, notwithstanding that he'd been director designate for over a year by that time. There's just a reference at the very bottom of that page to the single bag committee. I'm not going to go into that topic in any detail, but if we go over the page, you'll see there the tension with Scotland, with Dr. Lane saying its formation and work was criticised by Scotland. And then there are some observations in paragraph 174. Dr. Lane says, I think it's worth making the point that so far as FFP production was concerned, 3 opportunities presented themselves during the period relevant to this litigation. The first was that resulting from the David Owen £500,000 injection. This enabled BPL to effectively double its production of factor VIII concentrate. The second was the development of optimal additive solutions, permitting blood to be totally separated, resulting in an increase of 30% in recovered plasma volume. The third opportunity to increase FFP could have resulted from more use of plasmapheresis, enabling donors to donate a greater plasma volume. The introduction of single plasma donations and pro rata return to RHAs of products in relation to volume of plasma supplied to BPL were further contributory factors. So there is a summary from Dr. Lane of a number of factors which he identifies as significant in terms of the ability to increase the supply of plasma. And then if we go to the bottom of page 73, this is following a discussion about Dr. Maycock's report, which again was covered in Mr. Hill's presentation. At the bottom of the page, paragraph 179, Dr. Lane makes this observation. In retrospect, however, the Owen initiative rebounded on the service in that it supported growth in demand for factor VIII, but only a basis for limited supply and growth in output from MBTS and BPL sources. The growth at BPL focused attention on the effects of transition from a development laboratory to a manufacturing enterprise, now seriously below pharmaceutical standards. The problem was that the basic infrastructure of BPL remained one which was appropriate to a laboratory engaging in research and relatively small-scale production. The buildings dating back to the 1950s were old, small, and not appropriately designed for manufacturing. In 1979, the Medicines Inspectorate condemned the facility. However, while still inadequate, it was now a facility making a significant contribution to the increasing requirements of haemophiliacs for factor VIII concentrate. In retrospect, it would have been less disruptive to the NHS if the consequences of inspection had been met in 1976, when the licence application to manufacture was submitted to the Department of Health. So that appears to be, in part at least, a call or a suggestion that earlier inspection and the consequent decision-making might have been a better course. I'm going to move to 1979 next, page 79. Dr. Lane deals with 1979 in terms of self-sufficiency in paragraphs 187 to 238 of the proof. What he says in paragraph 187 is this, and this is obviously an expression of opinion. In terms of self-sufficiency, by 1979, it was too late, having regard to the 4 to 5 years it would take to plan and build a new facility, for a decision in this regard to have made any difference, if, as I would submit, the majority of severe haemophiliacs were infected with HIV before 1985. That said, 1979 saw the Medicines Inspectorate carry out their inspection of BPL's facilities in April, and the publication of their findings severely criticising virtually every aspect of the BPL facility in the summer. From my discussions with the inspectors during the course of their initial inspection, I was fairly clear in my own mind what the outcome would be, even before their report was available, and this prompted me to press for a decision by the DOH on the future of BPL. And then Dr. Lane goes on to consider, the bottom of that page, his paper on the function of stopgap and phased redevelopment of the blood products laboratory. I don't propose to go to that. However, and indeed it's been looked at, I think, in the course of Mr. Hill's presentation. If we go to page 81, paragraph 193 is Dr. Lane's a brief reference to the inspection itself in April 1979. And he says, from my discussions with the inspectors during the course of their visits, my expectation that they would be severely critical of the facility was confirmed by their comments. So much so that on the 2nd of May 1979, I wrote to Mr. Dutton at the DH, setting out my observations on their visit prior to the publication of their first formal report. And that letter is at CBLA 40938. 2nd of May 1979, addressed to Mr. Dutton in the DHSS, he says in the last part of the first paragraph that he believes his own views will differ but little from the Medicines Division report. And in the second paragraph says this: I would like to reiterate that from my point of view as the new director, the visit of the Medicines Division describes the laboratory very much in the condition in which I took it over. Mindful of the shortcomings of the existing system and somewhat contrary to the previous director's feelings, I both welcome and encourage this inspection, since I believe it is quite contrary to good manufacturing practice to use a privileged situation to hide the considerable deficiencies of BPL. In addition, and also contrary to the previous director's views, I believe that Medicines Division, through their inspectorate and acting on behalf of the Secretary of State for the Health Service, have a responsibility to assist a central health service production laboratory like BPL to carry out its function in the best possible way. There is within the division a considerable wealth of experience and information which should be made available to us quite normally through the health service. And then I don't think we need to look at the detail. If we go over the page, just so that you know, Dr. Lane sets out well, actually, we will just look at the first paragraph, I think, on that second page, and the rest really flows from it. He says, at the outset of the inspector's visit, I observed they would find little in this laboratory which did not stem from three things. First, intrinsic deficiencies of the building and the constraints arising primarily out of the leasehold arrangements which govern BPL's development. Second, a quantitative and qualitative deficiency in staff arising from our inability to compete with industry at the level required to recruit process/technical and scientific staff which are needed. Third, the fact that the laboratory is in a transitional stage between what Malcolm Harris chose to call quite aptly a cottage industry into a major production process moulded along commercial industrial lines. And then Dr. Lane goes on to develop a number of those points further in the course of the letter. If we go back to his witness statement, or draft proof, I should say, CBLA 605_002, and go to page 86. So he is here commenting upon a discussion of a paper he'd authored about the continuation of stopgap at a meeting of the Scientific and Technical Committee in June 79. And he says in paragraph 206, discussion eventually led to the conclusion that the DOH should proceed to prepare a complete appraisal of the various possibilities open and their cost effectiveness for consideration by the committee in September. This should precede any approach to ministers regarding the future of BPL. And then this observation from Dr. Lane: it seemed to me at the time that matters were still drifting and likely to continue to do so for some months. And I expressed the hope that there would be an early decision in principle on the development of BPL. The next few paragraphs of his statement really deal with meetings and reports which are covered in Mr. Hill's presentation. And so I think if we go to, well, I'd just ask you to note, I don't think we need to go to it, paragraph 220 of the draft proof. Dr. Lane refers to concerns he had about his liability as director of BPL if there was an adverse event, and how he was unable to get a clear answer from lawyers as to the extent of his responsibilities. If we then go to page 93, now in the autumn of 1979, paragraph 223 refers to a report which he prepared. We don't need to look at the report, but just see why, according to the proof, Dr. Lane thought that report or the paper was necessary. He says, this paper was prompted by the need, as I saw it, to ensure that we did not attempt to resolve the problems faced by BPL without regard to those which were faced by the regional transfusion centres who were providing our raw materials. The DH would have received my report. I feel fairly sure that at the time I wrote it, I was also preparing myself for another attempt to lift the hold on stopgap. And then you'll see he refers again to his view that there should be an entity which took responsibility for the National Blood Transfusion Service. We can see then at the bottom of page 95, this is a discussion which flows from a meeting of the Scientific and Technical Committee on the 26th of September 1979, at which Dr. Lane was present. And we return to the theme of the use of PFC to fractionate English and Welsh plasma. Dr. Donnell, who was very much an advocate for the Scottish PFC, raised the question of the absence of PFC representatives on the Scientific and Technical Committee. I remained concerned about the claims made of PFC by Mr. Watt. Mr. Smart suggested that to clear the path for a decision to redevelop BPL, the claims for PFC be tested. Mr. Watt and Mr. Cash were required to agree to a trial of fractionation. I deal with this in more detail below, and that's a reference to the events that I think we discussed on a number of occasions, not least during the evidence of Dr. Wolford. Just then ask you to note in paragraph 230, Dr. Lane refers to a paper put together in October 1979 by Professor Mollison, and then he refers to reasons for the committee rejecting the idea of abandoning production at BPL. He sets out three reasons. I just want to look at the third, which is subparagraph C. Just go further down the page. Plasma from paid donors is known to be more likely to transmit disease, particularly hepatitis, than is plasma from volunteer donors. So that's what the document that Dr. Lane is commenting on said. What Dr. Lane then observes in paragraph 231 is this. He says, I think this last point is an oversimplification and probably not correct as so far as hepatitis non-A, non-B is concerned. It was most probably true of HIV. And we'll pick up on Tuesday morning some of Dr. Lane's observations in his proof about hepatitis, but you'll see reflected there a view that hepatitis was not necessarily more likely to be transmitted by paid donors, is what he was setting out there. If we move now to page 99, we get to 1980. Dr. Lane deals with events in 1980 from paragraphs 239 to 288 of the draft proof. We can see in paragraph 239 Dr. Lane's recollection of the discussion of the future of BPL at a meeting of the Scientific and Technical Committee in January 1980. We don't need to look at the detail of it, which is the discussion which is set out in the documents. But if we go towards the bottom of that paragraph, we can see, perhaps we pick it up where it says there's mention of cooperative ventures with industry. I pointed out it was necessary to ensure that the Minister, Dr. Gerard Warne, appreciated the interdependence between the laboratory and the regional transfusion centres. The measures proposed fell somewhere short of stopgap, of course, did not include any commitment to redevelop BPL. Since I saw stopgap merely as a stage in the comprehensive redevelopment of BPL, I was disappointed. Then he refers in the last sentence to seeking a firm policy statement from the Department of Health on the planning work for the redevelopment of BPL. And so you will have seen, sir, by some of the references to which I've taken you, a theme in this part of Dr. Lane's proof is a theme of his concern, disappointment at the speed or lack of speed in the decision-making on the part of the Department of Health in relation to the redevelopment of BPL. If we move on to page 103, paragraph 252, this is Dr. Lane's reference to the visit to BPL by the Minister of State, Dr. Gerald Warne, on the 21st of March. 6 lines down, Dr. Lane says, my own impression at the end of the visit was that having heard the views from the staff and from management regarding BPL being commercially run, all expressed reservations about this. The Minister was convinced of the need to upgrade BPL in the short term and redevelop it thereafter. So that was his impression, as he's saying in this statement from the visit. However, the Minister decided to reduce available funds which were already inadequate for the task of satisfactorily upgrading BPL in the short term on the understanding that a decision would be taken about long-term redevelopment. No actual commitment was made to the latter. Now, again, we've explored a number of these stages in the decision-making process in earlier hearings, but this is Dr. Lane's take on it. He then refers in the next paragraph to the meeting of the Scientific and Technical Committee on the 23rd of April. Picking it up in the third line, he says, paragraph 4 is a very brief and in retrospect perhaps somewhat optimistic record of the Minister's visit to BPL in March. But paragraph 5 on page 3 of the minutes contained what at the time was something of a bombshell as far as I was concerned. And then there is the quotation from the minutes about BPL. If we go over the page, the citation from the minutes continues for the whole of that page, and you'll see in particular at little Roman 4, so the penultimate paragraph, there's the reference there to the possibility of commercial partnership. And it may be that that's what Dr. Lane is referring to as a bombshell. In any event, on the next page, this is, again, Dr. Lane's take. To me, the implications were clear enough. We'd already, prior to the Minister's visit, been promised a sum of money which was inadequate to meet the very modest targets of stopgap, which sum of money was to be spent in a somewhat piecemeal fashion with one eye on the medicines inspector's requirements. Now it seemed that the Minister was saying that even this sum was to be reduced. The stopgap programme originally envisaged was intended to improve the existing BPL facilities, enable us to make reasonable increases in our production output pending a major redevelopment of the BPL. The Medicines Inspectorate had effectively put a cap on any increases in production and had set a series of not unreasonable requirements for BPL, since it appeared we would not be allowed to pursue stopgap as originally perceived, which would have taken care of most of the inspector's concerns. Future manufacturing requirements will be more compromised by lack of resources than envisaged even before the Minister's visit. So that's Dr. Lane's assessment. There's then, in the following pages, and Dr. Lane recounts various other meetings, but really largely by reference to the contents of the documents themselves. If we go then to page 109, we can see in paragraph 263, Dr. Lane's reference to the meeting in June 1980 to discuss further question of expenditure on the upgrading of BPL, and he refers to being asked to provide a list of what he would have invested if given only £500,000. This is Dr. Lane's take on that. I can only liken the situation to one where you're told you may purchase a motor car and subsequently informed that you only be allowed a sum of money which is materially less than the purchase price and should decide which bits of the car you would like to buy. And then paragraph 264, the next paragraph, we're back on the PFC and fractionation in Scotland. Reference to an ad hoc meeting of regional transfusion directors 18th of June, in which it was noted the director of the PFC had indicated he was in a position to fractionate any plasma that the Birmingham RTC might care to send. The regional transfusions directors agreed the aim should be to see that PFC was in a position to fractionate all the Birmingham regional transfusion centres, and for that matter other regions' plasma. Then if we go on to page 111, we pick it up at paragraph 270. There's reference to a letter, 4th of July, from Dr. Dunnell to Dr. Gerald Warne, in respect of which Dr. Lane makes this comment. It's interesting to see him, that's Dr. Dunnell, making several points which I was in agreement with at the time and one which I was not. First, Dr. Dunnell sought to stress that the expenditure required to maintain production at Elstree pending the building of a new facility, which for the purpose of his letter he took as given, was not to be regarded as somehow transitional wasted expenditure, but rather an integral part of the development of the new production facility. So that's what Dr. Dunnell was saying. And then this is Dr. Lane's comment. I've been advocating this for a little while, but as I've indicated above, I expressed concern from time to time that this point did not appear to be accepted by the DOH. And then over the page, the second point made by Mr. Dunnell, with which Dr. Lane is agreeing, was the expression of regret that there was not going to be a special health authority to manage the overall affairs of fractionation of human plasma. And then the third point, and this is where there is disagreement, relates to collaboration between England and Scotland. So paragraph 237, Dr. Lane says this: Dr. Dunnell makes a case for closer collaboration between England and Scotland. Throughout this period, I was unconvinced that Scotland had the ability to assist England to any great extent, despite what I regarded as excessive claims made from time to time by Mr. Watt. Dr. Dunnell, as I've mentioned, was involved in developing some of the equipment used at PFC and therefore sympathetic to the continued Scottish involvement and participation through PFC. As his letter makes clear, he was sensitive to the fact that this was certainly not an opinion I shared. There's a further reference in paragraph 275, top of page 113, to Dr. Dunnell pursuing closer links between England and Scotland. So this is the second half of the paragraph. He knew that proposing the participation of Mr. Watt in the working party was likely to cause some difficulties as far as I was concerned, and for that matter some others, but his perseverance eventually resulted in Mr. Watt joining the working party. I think that's all I need to show you in relation to that year, that hasn't otherwise been covered elsewhere or can't be picked up from a reading of the statement. If we then turn to 1981, page 120, so Dr. Lane's proof addresses 1981 in paragraphs 289 to 334. In paragraph 289, you'll see he says there were several events during the course of the year which are relevant to the issue of self-sufficiency. He refers to concentrate usage climbing, BPL having received the go-ahead for MARP 1. And then, if we go to the bottom of page 291, there is reference to a letter in the Times, January 1981, raising the issue of the future role of PFC Liberton. The the author of the letter, who was, I think, an academic based at the University of Bath, is recorded there as suggesting that the insufficiency of blood products in the UK was largely self-imposed by bureaucracy. And then there's a quotation from the letter on the next page. Criticism, it might be said, of the output from Elstree, described as limited by the plant and process, which are largely outmoded and inefficient by modern standards. And then it said, in contrast, production in Scotland's limited by the blood supply. The plant at Edinburgh is seriously underutilised, working at less than 1/3 of its current capacity. And then there's a reference to blood not being sent across the border because the health departments for England and Wales and for Scotland are independent. And then the author of the letter writes this: in my view, the state of affairs is nothing less than scandalous. Paragraph 292 is Dr. Lane's riposte. This was incorrect. PFC Liberton's equipment was designed for continuous operation, and one stage in a multi-stage process had a potential capacity of an estimated 6,000 litres per week. This capacity was not matched by similar capacity in other stages which both preceded and followed. Likewise, the stage in question required 24-hour manning, a situation never agreed or accepted by the workforce. Then he refers to there being a detailed comparison in the course of 1981 of the products and says, my impression, to the extent that we could get to the truth of the matter, was that the PFC products were of lower specification. Dr. Lane then refers to the trial that took place at Liberton and says, this trial clearly showed that without substantial investment in building new facilities and installing additional plant and equipment up and down stream of the central processing plant and equipment, PFC Liberton could not operate to the stated capacity. And then you'll note paragraph 293 sets out Dr. Lane's view that this letter to the Times was also inaccurate in terms of plasma supply. And he concludes paragraph 293 by saying, at the time in question, there was no material surplus of plasma, which for want of fractionation capacity was being wasted, and therefore no immediate role for PFC Liberton to play, since they would merely be taking plasma which BPL, PFL needed. And then you'll see he refers in the next paragraph to a response from Dr. Harris, DCMO, to the letter in the Times.
By talking about upstream and downstream of the central processing plant and equipment, he's talking about before and after.
Yes.
He's not actually criticising the ability to produce, the ability to do so, apart from the question about staff.
I think that's right.
So it's a question in the terms of which I was talking to Mr. Hill about it, of the refrigeration of plasma coming in and the warehousing of stock going out, is it? Is that what he probably means?
It may be. I'm afraid I can't shed any further light on what was in Dr. Lane's mind other than what's in the proof. We'll be able to see whether Dr. Foster has any particular understanding.
Yes, it might be quite interesting to explore what he has to say about that.
Exactly. And then if we go to bottom of page 125, page 302, picks up a document prepared by Dr. Dunhill in February, which again deals with PFC Liberton. So if we go over the page, we can see that there's a citation from the document itself, but Dr. Lane describes these as partisan comments by Dr. Dunhill. And then I'm not going to read through what Dr. Dunhill himself said. That's set out in the document itself. But if we go to the bottom of the page, we can then see this is Dr. Lane's response. In these various comments, one glimpses Dr. Dunhill's sympathies. Whilst automation had been brought into the plant at Liberty, a plant designed in theory for continuous operation, the laboratory was nevertheless plagued by manpower problems and the refusal to work shifts. Reference in the third paragraph to coherent management, which Dr. Dunnell was suggesting was a way of addressing the issue, was an unrealistic proposition. The real problems lay in the terms and conditions imposed by the union and the structure within the NHS itself. If we go next to page 134, bottom of the page, paragraph 319, we're now in August 1981, and the first meeting of the policy steering group formed to assist in relation to the redevelopment of BPL. And paragraph 319 says it was reported that the potential for PFC Liberton to fractionate a proportion of English plasma had not yet been determined. And then if we go on to the next page, there's a little further information set out. And then in the last sentence of that paragraph, Dr. Lane observes the role of PFC Liberton's mentioned again. This reference marks the slight shift in thinking. Dr. Wolford suggested that it might prove uneconomical to send plasma to Liberton to fractionate. And you'll recall this is an issue that was explored with Dr. Wolford during her oral evidence. If we go over the page, page 136, paragraph 322 contains Dr. Lane's comments on a meeting of the Advisory Committee on the National Blood Transfusion Service in September 1981. And you'll see, if we pick it up, we'll pick it up in the third line, because this is really comment by Dr. Lane. Dr. Tovey ducked the issue of keeping regional transfusion directors informed of commercial purchases made by haemophilia centre directors. There was clearly no way all the haemophilia centres would give up their budgets. Also, no procedure was implemented to ensure that regional transfusion directors were kept informed of commercial purchases. As I've mentioned previously, this question of control over factor rate concentrate was a perennial theme. And he continues observing how haemophilia centres were protective of their position in terms of controlling their own purchases of commercial factor 8. There's then, the end of that paragraph, a further reference to the potential use of PFC Liberton, where it says Mr. Harley again hinted that PFC Liberton might be jointly meeting the UK's needs for blood products with any redeveloped BPL. The issue is picked up on the next page, paragraph 324. Picking it up in the third line, end of the third line, Dr. Lane says, I discussed the problems associated with PFC Liberton and the claims made for it with Mr. Smart, who was the chairman of the policy steering group. He suggested that we should again try to resolve the extent of PFC's role by a trial of fractionation. If we go to the bottom of the page, there's then comment by Dr. Lane on a letter from Mr. Watt in terms of data that was being produced regarding PFC Liberton products. And Dr. Lane says PFC Liberton did not, in the course of time, produce all the relevant data. Over the page, top of the page, Dr. Lane suggests that Mr. Watt misdescribes the English albumin product, deliberately obscures the true nature of the albumin products produced in England and in Scotland. We pick it up then down the bottom of that page, paragraph 330. Now, at the Policy Steering Group meeting in October 1981, there's a further discussion about the proposed trial at PFC Liberton. And Dr. Lane says they had not been receptive to the idea that we send observers, an idea, he says, which originated with me. And then, next page, 139, paragraph 333. There's a further description in the Scientific and Technical Committee meeting in November 1981, a further discussion about the use of PFC Liberton. It's recorded the shift working experiment had been carried out, and Dr. Lane says that the PFC trial related only to an evaluation of continuous production of SPPS. Factor 8 production was not included. Dr. Lane then records various matters being set out by Dr. Dunnell. Over the page, we can see in paragraph 334 further consideration about the PFC trial. And if we pick it up about halfway down that paragraph, we see, consistent with what we've seen from Dr. Lane's statement so far, he expressed reservations regarding the experiment. He said the study had concentrated on one stage only of what was a complete production process. And then we get to then the reference to the facilities both up and downstream. He says the experiment at PFC Liverton was inconclusive. The commitment of the SHHD to PFC Liverton would be critical to the mode of its future use. So that brings us to the end of 1981. We just go to the top of the next page, 1982, which Dr. Lane addresses in paragraphs 335 to 365 of his proof. He sets out, or he discusses there the report on the PFC Liverton trial, and he says in the third line, it seemed to me that the report supported my concerns about PFC Liverton's ability to assist England and Wales in the production of factor VIII. And he goes on to describe that further and set out his own feeling that the experiment was inconclusive. There's a further account in this part of the statement, if we go over the page, paragraph 336 deals with the issue in relation to PFC. And then if we go to the next page, page 143, paragraphs 338 to 339, refers to a letter from SHHD, so from the Scottish Home and Health Department to the Department of Health, January 1982, about the contribution PFC could make. And you may recall, so we looked at this letter, I'm pretty sure, during the evidence of Dr. Walford, and you'll see there the reference to the need for substantial investment. Dr. Lane's summary of this over the page at paragraph 340, as he says, in summary, it was clear that without substantial changes in working practices, an investment of 6 to 7 million, but with no guarantee this was an accurate estimate, a delay of some 2.5 years, again with no guarantee this was an accurate estimate, PFC Liverton would be in a position to fractionate sufficient amounts of English plasma, but at a cost which no one could predict. And then there are further discussions in relation to Liverton, in paragraph 342, bottom of this page, and over onto page 145, but I don't think they add to the underlying documents. We can then, I think, pick up the position in relation to 1982 at the bottom of page 152, where Dr. Lane has now reached the point in his chronological overview where the CBLA has been established. And so he refers to what was, I think must have been the first meeting of the CBLA on the 3rd of December 1982. Yes, in fact, if we go over the page, he refers to the members' meeting for the first time. And then if we pick it up at 363, this is Dr. Lane's, I think, take on 1982. He says, thus the year closed with CBLA in the management driving seat and with DH Treasury approval for the redevelopment of BPL on the basis of a capacity which it was generally agreed amongst all the interested parties would be enough to achieve self-sufficiency. 364, he says, it was not expected that the redeveloped BPL would be available to produce factor VIII before 85-86. In the event, it was commissioned in 87-88. By this time, HIV transmission and coagulation products had been effectively controlled. And then the next paragraph, it can be seen, therefore, that the CBLA was established too late to have any influence over the primary definitions of self-sufficiency. So there we see, again, the response effectively on behalf of the CBLA to the claim. But that, of course, doesn't answer the question of whether bodies, organisations, individuals other than the CBLA could have influenced matters differently. So in relation to the years that follow, in the proof. There isn't any particular passage I wanted to take you to. So if I could have the indulgence of 2 minutes, we can finish, I think, the issue of self-sufficiency.
Yes, certainly.
So I'll just give the paragraph references in the draft proof. Dr. Lane deals with 1983 in relation to self-sufficiency in paragraphs 366 to 377 of the proof. 1984 in paragraphs 378 to 389. And 1985, which was the last year his proof looked at, paragraphs 390 to 398. And so what we then get to is a summary of the position in relation to self-sufficiency from Dr. Lane's perspective. Sorry, Paul, if we could have the statement back on the screen. It's page 168. And you'll see there, it's headed Summary of Self-Sufficiency Claims and CBLA Rebuttal. So that's really the point of this part of his proof. He's responding on behalf of the CBLA to the particulars of negligence and or breach of statutory duty in relation to the issue of self-sufficiency. He sets out each of the allegations in the re-amended main statement of claim. And if we just go a little further down the page, we can see here the essence of the point that Dr. Lane was seeking to make, which was by the time the CBLA took over responsibility, the decision had, to all intents and purposes, been taken, and that had been a decision for the Department of Health. And really that's what he essentially runs through, what he says in the next, in his responses to each of the allegations on the issue of self-sufficiency. So we just look at page 170. The allegation there set out is the allegation of a failure to cooperate with regional health authorities sufficiently in providing a national blood transfusion service. And his observation is CBLA is not responsible for providing the national blood transfusion service. That's the responsibility of regional health authorities. And then he goes on to talk about to go back to and pick up on some of the themes about the lack of coordination, the lack of a structure, the lack of control over funds and so on. And then next page, 171, paragraph 404 refers to the allegation of a failure to assess future needs of Factor 8. Again, the key point is that he makes is that by the time the CBLA was established, December 82, he says the future needs had been accurately estimated and formed the key to the planned redevelopment of BPL. So, again, his essential point is this isn't something you can lay at the door of the CBLA because of the issue of timing. And then if we just go to page 173, this is the issue of the allegation of the failure to use the spare production capacity in Scotland. We've seen Dr. Lane's views fairly clearly set out in the proof so far, but his short answer is this issue had been run to ground shortly before CBLA took over BPL. And then he gives a slightly more detailed account of why he thought that was not a realistic option, to the extent that if we go towards the bottom of that paragraph, he says this: the belief that there was any significant spare capacity immediately available for fractionating English and Welsh plasma at PFC Liberton was, I believe, a myth. And then there are a number of allegations which he deals with very shortly on the next page, in which, again, he essentially says these are not matters that were the responsibility of the CBLA or are not particularly relevant to the CBLA. And that concludes his proof insofar as the issue of self-sufficiency and indeed the organisation of the blood transfusion service and its relationship with BPL was concerned. He then goes on to look at issues relating to viral infection, response to that and heat treatment. And although they still account for several hundred pages in his statement, I should be able to deal with those much more shortly. Heat treatment we've effectively covered through Mr. Hill's presentation, the evidence of Dr. Smith I've already referred to. So I'll take you to a handful of references, but Dr. Lane doesn't add an enormous amount in that regard. But I will show you some of what he says about hepatitis and other viral infections on Tuesday morning.
Very well. Tuesday morning it is then at 10 o'clock. 10 o'clock Tuesday.